All right, guys, welcome back to another video. And with the ICC 2024 T20 Cricket World Cup kicking off over the weekend in the United States, I thought it would be a good chance to sit down and have a look at the three stadiums that the US has put together for this tournament. Now, as we know, the US is not a cricketing nation, so it's always interesting seeing what sort of stadium concepts host nations will come up with when they're hosting a sport that they do not commonly play. Now, this is the first time the US has hosted any major cricket tournament, especially internationally, and unfortunately, some of the dialogue that is coming out of America is that this is not getting the attention that it probably should be in the media. It's not getting that cut through with the local US population. And I think unfortunately they've got the timing a little bit wrong here. We know the NHL's Stanley Cup ice hockey and the NBA finals are going to be kicking off in the next few days. So you are going to be having a big clash between this tournament and two of the biggest events on the American sporting calendar. Now, the US is only hosting some group stage games for the T20 World Cup. So they're not hosting any finals or knockout games. So this will be all done by the 16th of June, and that is going to be before the Stanley Cup finals and also the NBA finals do end. So you're not going to get any clear air with this tournament in the US media. Now, obviously baseball runs all summer, so it's going to be impossible to avoid a clash with the MLB baseball. But I wish they could have pushed this cricket tournament back a couple of weeks and you would just be competing with the baseball. You wouldn't have to worry about the ice hockey or the basketball. But it is hard to put together the schedule because there is a lot going on in the world of cricket, so there is obviously reasons for it. Now, there are three American stadiums hosting games in this tournament, and unfortunately, the way it's fallen with those other sports is that the Dallas Mavericks in the NBA and the Florida Panthers in the NHL ice hockey have made it to the finals of their respective sports. And it just so happens that those two markets are two of the three host cities for the ICC Cricket World Cup. So that is going to make things a little bit harder with the cut through of those US residents in terms of this tournament. Now, we know there is a large Indian and Pakistani diaspora in the US, and obviously that is the case in pretty much every sort of first world country. So you are going to get numbers through the gates. There is going to be a big fan base sort of at all the games, but it just depends what the ICC is trying to do with this tournament. Are they trying to cut through with the sort of non-cricket following US public, or are they just trying to appeal to the Indians and Pakistanis that obviously do already follow the game in the USA? Now, there's no games on the West Coast, which is a little bit disappointing. We know there's a large Indian population in the San Francisco Bay Area because of the tech focus in the Silicon Valley there. Also, Seattle doesn't get a game. So again, it is a little bit disappointing that there isn't any host cities on the West Coast, and also the fact that there is no knockout stage games in the USA. But anyway, let's get on with our first stadium today. That is Grand Prairie Stadium in Grand Prairie, Texas, in the Dallas metropolitan area. So if you guys have been watching the tournament, you would have noticed this did host the opening game between the US and Canada. Now, this stadium, it's a former baseball ballpark. And in 2022, it did receive a $20 million renovation to become a cricket-specific stadium. And that was largely due to the fact that the Major League Cricket T20 tournament that they did launch there did have a team based in the Dallas area, that being the Texas Super Kings, who do call this venue home. Now, this stadium's hosting 4 games in the World Cup. Capacity is about 15,000, so it's not too bad. You can sort of see there is just the one sort of permanent grandstand there. And that, when it was in the baseball configuration, would have been located sort of behind the home plate. And it is a little bit interesting because if you look at the sort of orientation of the ground, that stand is actually sort of backward point or deep backward square leg, depending on how you look at it. So it's not located behind the bowler's arm, which naturally that's the most popular viewing position for cricket. So it's a bit of a shame they couldn't orientate the ground that way, but probably there was some issues in terms of how the sun sets, so you don't want the batsman looking into the sun. You can see in that stand there are some corporate hospitality suites and a little small overhang there, which might provide a little bit of protection from the sun, but not much. And we know obviously in Texas it does get very hot during the day, so it would have been nice sort of if they extended that overhang during the renovations. Obviously, most seats are exposed to the elements in this configuration. Apart from that permanent stand, you do sort of have some temporary structures. That'll be the media centre, maybe some corporate hospitality at each end behind the bowler's arm. And in terms of the outfield, there's sort of minimal seating, maybe a bit of standing room, but there is not too much going on out there. Next up, we do have the Central Broward Park in Lauderhill, Florida. Now, this one's located in sort of the Fort Lauderdale area, north of Miami, around a 30-minute drive from Miami. And unlike the other two, this is actually a dedicated cricket stadium. This was built with cricket in mind. And you can sort of see that with some of the design elements and the way it has been put together. So this stadium is permanent. It has been open since 2007, where it was built for $70 million. And this actually does have a bit of pedigree in terms of hosting cricket. It has hosted T20s since 2010. The first series there was Sri Lanka versus New Zealand. I know the West Indies have also played there, maybe a few other teams, but it is a bona fide cricket stadium. Hosted its first ODI in 2019, hosting the US, and this one's hosting 4 games in the World Cup. Capacity is listed at 25,000, which seems a bit high. Not sure whether there's some temporary stands going in, or given that there is such a large proportion of grass banks, they are just allowing 25,000 to sort of congregate in there. Now this looks more like a sort of traditional cricket stadium, very similar to some of the stadiums in the West Indies. Sort of reminds me of the Sir Viv Richards Stadium in Antigua. Now I like that this one does have covered stands with that overhang. We know Florida is obviously very hot in summer due to how south it is, so you do need some sort of protection from the elements there. And in a lot of US stadiums in all sports really, there isn't a lot of cover from the stands. Well, definitely the older stadiums do not have a lot of cover. The newer ones, they are sort of either putting a retractable roof or a fixed roof, or at least some sort of overhang, especially in those southern states where it does get very hot during the summer. You can see there's a nice pavilion there. I like the red darkish colour there, and lots of grass banks, which are great for cricket, as we know, all around the world, in the West Indies, Sri Lanka, Australia, New Zealand. There's a lot of grass banks all over the place, but I think they might be putting in some temporary seating for the tournament, given the capacity is listed at 25,000. Not too much to say here, guys. I think this is probably, in terms of pure cricket stadiums, this is the pick of the bunch. But we will be moving on to the third and final stadium in the USA. That is Nassau County International Cricket Stadium in Westbury, New York. This one located in Long Island, and it's about 30 miles from Manhattan, or a 45-minute drive. So it is a fair distance from what most foreigners would associate with New York City. It is a temporary stadium, so this will be pulled down after the tournament, but I believe they're keeping the actual field and the pitch, so there will be sort of some small-scale local cricket that will be played here going forward. And the problem is, with New York, there's no space, so they have had to look sort of further afield to put this facility together. And unfortunately, that has meant that it is located a fair way out of the central area of Manhattan. And I wish they had have been able to put this in Central Park or something. I mean, that would have been amazing, right in the middle of the city. You would have had a lot of walk-ups from curious onlookers. Obviously, there's heaps to do before and after the game when it is located there. And I see, just going off the aerial imagery, this sheep meadow in Central Park looks like a fairly open space where potentially they could have done this, but I'm assuming the cost or whatever it is would have been too much. But that would have been an amazing concept and would have been so cool to see. I wish they did that. This is sort of the centerpiece of the US stadiums. It is hosting 8 games all up, including the biggest one of the tournament, India versus Pakistan. We know New York, massive cosmopolitan international city. There is a lot of Indians and Pakistanis who live there, so they will have no issues at all selling that one out. They probably could have filled it twice, in fact, which is amazing given it's in the USA where cricket is pretty much unknown. But it just speaks to the amount of Indians and Pakistanis that are living around the world. The capacity, again, is massive at 34,000, and I sort of wish this did host the final, just for that maximum impact with the American audience. When the finals and the knockout stages are hosted in the West Indies, it's just sort of going to fade from memory pretty quickly once the American stage of the tournament is done. So I wish the ICC had have just committed and played at least the final or some big knockout games in America, but unfortunately that isn't the case. The stadium itself, it is all temporary stands. There is no overhang for sun or rain protection. We know in New York there is still some variable weather during the summer months. Sort of has 6 sections of that temporary seating, but I do like how the lower bowl is connected so you can walk around along the concourses there. You can see there's sort of some large media centres at both ends. There's probably some corporate hospitality suites involved there, given the amount of money that is in New York. When you do have temporary stands, the exterior is going to look really bad, so it is all exposed. But really, with a temporary stadium, the exterior is not an issue at all. But again, given the location, it's just in the middle of a park in Westbury, New York. So there's not a lot of bar or restaurant areas around where fans can congregate before and after the game. And I think that's sort of important. They should have done some pop-up food stalls or pop-up bars and everything, because when it's not located centrally, you do sort of have to create that artificial atmosphere. And again, you could argue it's not a big deal because it's not a permanent stadium, but sort of wish they had just put a bit of infrastructure in and around the ground. But anyway, guys, that is going to do it for this video. I think they've done a good job in the US of putting together these venues. They do look pretty good and definitely better than some of the other cricket stadiums around the world. That is all we're going to have time for today, guys. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to subscribe.